Welcome back to the channel. It's so nice to be back here. Now talking about the camera gives me a little bit of a performance anxiety, but we're gonna go straight to it. Today we'll be doing a wrap up. So it's kind of like all the other books I've read this year. Following up the video that I uploaded like 8 months ago, I have read a couple more books. Definitely nowhere near the rate that I used to be able to read them at. Yeah, but I do have some really interesting books that I want to share with you all, so I'm excited to do that. So ever since that video, I actually participated in a book judging panel under the Singapore Book Publishers Association. So because of that panel, I had to read over like 20 books, and I'm not going to go through all of them in this video because I feel like I didn't really go too in-depth in any of these books when I was judging them. I was judging them based on kind of a brief understanding of the contents, but also the relevance of the publishing and the kind of full package of the book. So we had to look at like the design of the book, the publicity of the book, what was going around, like what was, also kind of launched alongside the book or things like that. So just to go through some of the books that I read as part of this panel, all of which I thought was really interesting. I think one particular standout for me was Artifice. It's a kind of like a sci-fi speculative fiction. Basically, as a protagonist, you're stuck in this kind of time experiment where you have to relive certain scenarios over and over again until you reach a breaking point, and the whole conversation is kind of between the protagonist and this new technology that they're developing, kind of like a humanoid in that sense. It was such a short book in a sense. I read it in all in like one day, maybe in one sitting even. And I was really surprised by the premise of the book and the writing actually, because I feel like it's such a very common trope in the sense of you see a lot of movies that talk about having to relive this one moment in time over and over again. But I did feel that some of the ethical considerations of like what tech is and what the human involvement in tech is kind of came out quite nicely in this book. I would say some parts of the book were still a bit cliche-ish, really about like fighting like good versus evil and really like action-packed scenes that felt very much like action for the sake of action. If we develop artificial intelligences that can outsmart us, at which point can we recognize that we still have some control over the environment, some control over the intelligence, or will we ever have to face a day where we have to negotiate with these intelligences as other human parts, right? But I do think that if you've read this kind of books before, I'm sure there are much more many more options out there for a much more in-depth and maybe even more like polished and sophisticated take on this trope. For a local literature based in Singapore, published in Singapore, I thought was not bad at all. So that was a standout for me. As for the other books, I can't really comment too deeply. I did read Cat Skull and A Bad Girl's Book of Animals before, so if you want to know more about my thoughts about those books, I'll link the videos where I talk about them in the description down below. In addition to reading a lot of literary books in Singapore, I also read a bunch of professional development books as part of this panel. So I did read quite a lot of interesting books about work. And as if you've followed my channel from like a really long time ago, I did do a few videos about work, and obviously my take on work is a bit more, I guess, like, I wouldn't want to say radical, but I do want to expand notions of work and what that means to us. And even for myself, I'm still figuring it out. Obviously, when I made those videos, I was very much like fresh out of school, and I had a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas, and I didn't expect any of those things to blow up at all. So reading these professional books were really quite interesting, and made me start to think about like, what really is the demographic of people out there in their everyday lives? Like, what is this demographic of people that are reading this book? I won't comment too much on these books because I'm obviously not a self-help channel. I'm also not like a professional development channel, and there are plenty of other channels that you can watch where they really break down like all these workplace principles and thinking really much more from that point of view. When I was reading those books for the panel, I was really looking at it as a panelist point of view. So I was not just thinking about my own subjectivities, I was also thinking about like the more broader appeal of these books as well as the broader publishing industry in Singapore. And that was a very new experience for me because a lot of my other panelists were much more experienced and veteran than me. So I learned a lot from talking to these judges and attending the ceremony itself. And obviously, like, a huge thanks to the association for inviting me, even because they wanted my opinions on the entire event, which was really nice, and I feel very very much appreciated for that. Moving back to the regular programming, I'm gonna now talk about the books that I read out of my own choosing. Okay, so ever since I finished reading Blockchain Chicken Farm from my previous video, I would say that I kind of went down this rabbit hole of reading about tech and its ethical implications, but also because for myself, I've personally completed a design course in like UX design because I had some experience working with creative technologists in my previous job, and I thought that was so interesting, and I didn't want to be so scared of technology, in a sense that I'm trying to find a balance between what we see as technology and what we see as the current crisis that we're living in, whether it's environmental, political, etc. And I also wanted to address my own fears around technology, in a sense that there was no way that technology would not be a part of our lives, right? Because technology is essentially, for us humans, what we invent to assist us in our everyday lives, and that could take the easy form of pen and paper to all the way of like really complicated engineering things that I can't even fathom. Right? Essentially, I went on to find a couple more books about tech. I cannot say that I finished these books because I'm still kind of making my way through them. So, like I was saying, I started picking up a lot of books about the digital world, and I was interested in the kind of ethics behind it, in a sense that Blockchain Chicken Farm was a really interesting read because it talked about technology in rural China, and the author herself kind of went to these places and found that her conceptions of what tech was kind of got broken down by these rural counterparts, in the sense that they were sometimes even more technologically advanced than the city center because of the specific demands of the rural areas in China. And you would see like these huge, like maybe even like Alibaba factories, right, in the rural area where people make their living solely from e-commerce in these areas, which is really, really interesting to me. And I find that it's something that really challenges my own conceptions of what tech is, having grown up in Singapore, only in Singapore, where the city is the country and the state, and we don't really have that rural connection to any other land. Yeah, and so that kind of sent me into a spiral. Another book that I was looking at is called The Future is Present, and this is a book that's written by Philip Glahn and Cary Levine. So this book talks about the work of Mobile Image. They are kind of like an art and technology group, and they created a lot of work talking about communications, networking, and information systems. So this is really like an art group that talks about internet in the early days and what that means for us. Reading through the first few chapters, it was really interesting to think about how art can be used to demystify technology and how it can be used to really like question the structures of technology in our world. I feel like there's so many kind of like conceptual frameworks about technology that I am not quite understanding myself, and that's something I want to go more into. I feel like for myself, a gap that I feel a lot is that when I read about environmental work and I read about the climate crisis, I feel like, wow, okay, like there's sometimes a sense of wanting to go back to the way things were. That's a huge inquiry for me right now. How do we integrate technology and an environment? How do we integrate our current systems of doing into a future that still allows us to work on what we invented technology for in the first place, which is to make our lives easier, to make our lives more connected to each other, while making sure that we are not doing harm to the environment and even reducing the harm that we've already caused to the environment. And if you have any books that talk about that, feel free to send them to me. I'm so interested in learning about the parallels between technological innovation and the study of nature and our understanding of nature. Going back to the other books that I've read, so I recently went to Japan with a friend on a holiday. While I was in Japan, I read this book called Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. Now, this is a really popular book. I've seen it everywhere for the longest time. I've never really read books like this because I have not really read a lot of translated fiction. While I was in Japan, I really, really wanted to read a book that I felt was resonant to me. So I picked up this book because I was thinking a lot about reproduction as well, like the ethics of reproduction. And I think if you've seen some of my earlier videos or some of the stuff that I've talked about, I've I've talked about this. I've talked about like, is it really ethical to have a kid in today's world? Is it really ethical to expect women to have children? And I wasn't expecting for myself to really resonate with this book at all. I was really, really, really stunned by how much resonance I was feeling from this book. Essentially, this book is about a protagonist that kind of goes through like two parts of her life. The first part is when she's kind of like a fledgling, starving artist, writer person in Japan. She has this older sister that is very preoccupied with getting breast implants. And this older sister has a daughter, I guess, which is the protagonist's niece, who writes also in her diary about how she couldn't understand her mother's desires to have these breast implants. That was very curious for me because I have not really read much stuff about beauty standards in a long time. I think in the last one I read about it was like Trick Mirror. And also for myself, I mean, like looking at my different circles of friends and how some of them are going through different life stages right now, you know, maybe getting married, having kids, and a lot of us are also thinking about our bodies changing at this age. Things about aging and beauty, and specifically about the woman's aging body, was really interesting to read about in this book. And the second half of the book talks about the eggs portion, right? This is when the main character, the protagonist, becomes a bit more obsessed herself with this idea of having a child. Now, she starts to get really involved with this society of children that are conceived by sperm donors. And she herself kind of starts to really think about this idea of having a child, right? And gets really, really invested in having her own child, but not with a father, but with a sperm donor. And talking to all these people who are anti, like, sperm donor activists. A lot of them talk about like the importance of having a father, the importance of having biological parents, and it just goes through a lot of the weird thoughts around like, is it natural for a woman to conceive without a husband, without a father figure, and also what really is this specifically womanly desire to have a child. And this is something that a lot of people have told me from young, that when I grow up I will want a child, like I would naturally desire a child in a sense of like having baby fever. Because for me, I felt like a lot of these pressures were social and cultural, and not so much like my inherent biology is making me want to meet this child. But one thing that really stood out for me from this book is how the author talks about wanting to meet their future child, and that they felt this almost transcendental spiritual experience of being compelled to meet their child, that their child was calling them from the future. And this was a sentiment that I kind of started to think about and understand from one of the earlier books that I've read, which I think it was about climate anxiety. And that book, it's a non-fiction book. That book talks about this idea of like that, having climate anxiety and thinking that, you would not have children because of climate reasons, that is actually essentially a privileged position. And actually, it is this human desire to want to have future generations and to teach and raise these future generations that ensures the resilience of humankind. But I saw that same sentiment in this book once again, in Breast and Eggs, and I felt like, wow, okay, maybe there is this strong, innate human desire to have a future in having children. Anyway, moving on to the next book. I also finished reading Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, written by Cat Bohannon. I also attended the talk by Cat Bohannon at the Singapore Writers Fest this year. She gave a brilliant talk, although I did feel that the talk did not encapsulate the entirety of the book. The book itself is a mammoth, and I'm really impressed at how Cat Bohannon was able to squeeze all of that into that book. I think the book was about like this thick. I don't have it with me now. I think maybe 600 pages or so. So many of those pages were footnotes, and Cat Bohannon really did a lot of citations, really did a lot of that. It's a book that literally tries to do what its title suggests, which is to really talk about the 200 million years of evolution. And I really like how Cat Bohannon kind of not only talked about the human in its very like recognizable form, but to also think about way before that, what were the first mammals that secreted breast milk for their offspring, and also thinking about like what were the first mammals that had the kind of placenta, had all these social behaviors as well. That kind of reminded me of the things that I used to study back in school. Overall, I think this book is really quite almost like a Bible in a sense. Like it's a book that shines a light on the most obvious yet like unstudied things, which is the female body. This book was such a joy to read. It was very thick and very intense. But if you're someone that does enjoy reading about science, and especially nowadays, reading about gendered statistics or gendered studies, across all disciplines, this is something that you definitely will enjoy as well. So, if you like your stats, you like your facts, you like your citations, you like, and also Cat Bohannon is super witty with her writing. I wouldn't recommend it to someone who has never read anything of this scale before. But if you're comfortable reading about these things, I think it is a definite yes from me. Something really fun to pick up once in a while and finish over a period of a few months, even. The last book I want to talk about before my battery dies on me is this book, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Now, this is a book I've seen in a lot of different places. I had a friend recommend this book to me a long time ago. I would say definitely as a genre, this is the kind of book I've never read before. It is translated from Italian, and it's historical fiction, kind of based in post-war Naples. It's about these two young women. So it's about Elena, and as well as her so-called best friend, Lila. I know this is only one book out of an entire series, and I'm actually quite compelled to read the rest because I want to know what happens to Lila. Like I kind of want to know how these characters grow up, and I've never really been that invested in a story like this where you see the children quite literally grow up and become adults, young adults in this case, at the end of this book. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with how complicated childhood and adolescent friendships can be. I do think this is a book that captures that pretty well, especially in thinking about female friendships. And I specifically say that because the tension between the two characters here, Elena and Lila, it's really quite intriguing and it's really quite captivating in a way that I've never really thought about. At some points, I did feel that Alina is leaning quite towards the sapphic side, which I will be quite curious to know if any of you do have a queer reading of this book. But ultimately, talking about what it means to be a young woman, what it means to grow up to be a woman, what it means to be an educated woman, what it means to live in this period of social mobility, what it means to make an honest living, what it means to basically be from a small town but have dreams and ambitions much bigger than what you were born into, much bigger than the circumstances that you were given. I think this book really captures that. And I really enjoy the fact that the title, My Brilliant Friend, is something that both characters use for each other. I was really quite touched by that in the sense that both Alina and Lila see their counterpart, like they see each other as the most brilliant friend that they have, but they themselves are kind of consumed and preoccupied with this sense of inadequacy, with this sense of desperation. Yeah, like this eternal competition between the two of them as these two young ladies of this town, and being embroiled in all of the family feuds and understanding politics of the town as well. And there's some hints of also like the social and political unrest of the time, which is also quite cool to see kind of peek through these characters' lives. The first few chapters, I was like, okay, this is boring. Like, why am I reading about these children? But the characters and the way that they're set up and the way that they progress, it can be quite confusing at times. Luckily enough, in the first few pages of the book, there is kind of like little like directory of the characters, so like you can kind of see like who is related to who and who are the parents of who. And it's really important to know who the parents are of these children, and it kind of made me think about generational ties. At one point, there is this problematic character, who is the father of one of the boys that the main protagonist is somehow involved with. Some of the questions that came up is, to what extent do our parents define us as their children? To what extent can we seek forgiveness for what our parents have done? Or to what extent can we, as their children, change their circumstances through our hard work or through our luck and fortune? I kind of went into this book thinking that it would just be about friendship, and it very much is. It really is about friendships that are forged between the two girls, but also across the different young people of the town. It could be even between the girls and the boys themselves. There's so many ways you could read this, and I'll be quite curious to see how the adaptation, the HBO version, kind of stands against this book. Okay, my battery is obviously dying multiple times, and I think this is a good time for me to just end this video. It's a really long video, and I think my next one I will talk more about the books that I'm currently reading, and I will also talk about the top books that I've picked out for this year. Now, every year I always feel like I don't read enough, but I do this crazy sprint at the end of the year where I try to finish all the books I've had on my current reads and all that. So thank you all so much once again, and I'm so excited to come back home. So take care, stay hydrated, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!